Hello, Premium Poker friends, and welcome to the webinar going over the homework problems from September of 2018. As always, accompanying this video on the Patreon post will be a copy of the answer key / teacher's edition, which you'll want to go ahead and print out and have a copy of as we go over. As I always say for these, it's more important how you arrived at your answers and the analysis and the exercise that you went through in working through these problems that's the most important. But for purposes of this video, I am going to go over what I got from my answers so you can see my rationale, and it's more kind of important that you follow me along with my rationale and see kind of how it's squared up with your own. So for that, you're going to want to have a copy of this. Go ahead and print it out. Have it in front of you, and I'm going to be referring to it as we go along. So for this month's homework problems, again, this is September of 2018. This is based on a real hand that I played at the Borgata, as usual, 2-5, and it was not on the podcast. The main villain for this hand is a player who'd been speaking about being in a tournament earlier in the day, and one of the tournament series was in town at this point. This guy is in his late 20s. He had gotten knocked out, and he came over to play some cash. Pretty standard issue scenario that you find during the big tournament series. And as has been the case lately with a lot of these tournament kids, they are pretty good. And this guy seemed to have a decent head on his shoulders, be a decent thinking player, and somebody who we probably want to at least start off with a certain level of balance in our play against. We might go exploitative as we move along in the hand, but more on that in a little while. But we want to start off balanced, and that's why this makes a good homework problem. Okay. So one thing we do know is that while he has a decent level of positional awareness pre-flop, he is also opening a wider range from later positions, as we would expect him to do. His post-flop play is generally tight and passive. That is certainly not the case with some of these tournament kids, but this one seemed to have more of a grinder air about him, and so hence a little bit more tightness than we would expect maybe otherwise, and a little bit more passivity. But I say that he's neither a nit nor a calling station. So again, those minor tendencies towards tightness and a little bit of passivity don't fall into categories that we find rec players falling into where they're highly exploitable. This guy's tendencies just kind of drift in that into those two realms, though. Our own image, my image, the heroes for this problem, is loose. I've been caught bluffing in several recent hands and wound up raising some others, which didn't go to showdown, but generally speaking, you can tell that the table was pretty ticked off at my overall level of aggression, which is quite high, and people are probably looking to bluff catch me a little bit more than usual. So the effective stack size for this hand is the villains at $1,000. Okay, so into our problems. So pre-flop, we're in the small blind, and there is one limper from an early position, and I'm just going to assume that our villain here is going to treat that like I treat that, which is just he's going to pretty much ignore one limper. He may adjust his play for a bunch of limpers, but he's probably just going to open his normal range from where he is, and that is in the button. And so he opens at $25 in the button, same exact standard sizing I would use, so nothing strange there, and we are next to act in the small blind. So question one is, what type of 3-betting range structure do we want to be adopting here, and why? Now, in some of our past homework problems, last month we talked about adopting a polarized range, and what that is, we discussed, I think I used the analogy of like a Oreo cookie. I kind of like Oreo cookies, if you can't tell by looking at me. I've had an Oreo cookie or two in my day. That there's, in a polarized 3-betting range, we have 3 elements. We have a upper layer, upper cookie, if you will, and this is our 3 bets for value. And then we have a middle range of calls, and then we have a lower range of 3 bets that are a bluff. And then right under that, we, of course, have our everything else that we're going to fold. And that's a polarized structure. In this hand, we're going to use the opposite of that, which is a depolarized, or what's called a linear structure. And the reason we want to do that, we want to do that normally from the blinds anyway. And here's why, is that especially against a player who is positionally conscious like this, and we can tell that by the fact that he is opening wider from later positions. What he's going to do also is he's going to defend more to our 3-bets, period, when he's going to be in position to us. And of course, when we're 3-betting out of the blinds, that's necessarily going to be the case. So against somebody who is a better player and more positionally aware, that's the number one reason why you want to adopt a linear/depolarized structure from the blinds, is because you want to have a stronger range because you're going to get called a lot more. Let's not forget, all right, when we are adopting a polarized 3-bet structure and we have those light 3-bet bluffs, all right, we use those because they are hands that we don't mind going post-flop with, but that's not the primary goal. The primary goal when we raise as a bluff, always in poker, is to just take the hand down right there. And light 3-bet bluffs are no exception to that rule. So when we're 3-betting light with something like ace-5 suited, okay hand, it's got an ace, it's got the draw to the wheel straight, it's got, it's got a lot going for it, right? But what do we primarily want to do when we bet 3-bet light with that? We're trying to just take down what's in the pot pre-flop, move on to the next hand. If we get called, okay, now we're on to plan B. Well, when we're in the small blind here, we have to figure that we're going to get called a lot more. So we're going to wind up going post-flop a lot more. So we want to, as a result of that, have a much, much stronger range that is going to stand to be ahead of our opponent's calling range here a decent amount of the time. Now, that being said, we're not just going to 3-bet premium hands only that we intend to stack off with 100% of the time if our opponent comes over the top of us in 4-bets. So, i.e., we're not going to play like some kind of old nit who only 3-bets aces and kings for that precise reason. As soon as they 3-bet, you better know that if you 4-bet them, they're just going to shove because they're only doing it with hyper premiums. No, we're still going to have kind of two bands to our linear 3-betting range here. All right, and that's what questions 2 and 3 here go over. So let me show you my answers and the corresponding ranges here. So already right here I have loaded up, that is my answer to number 2, which is, this is the premium component of my overall linear 3-bet range. And that is just a nice tight 34 combos of queens plus and ace king. That's it. Okay, so if our opponent here shoves on us, well, it wouldn't be a shove at this point, but 4-bets, we're just going to go ahead and get it in here with all of this. And as I put later on in my answer to number 6, I'll get into the full answer for that in a moment, but I left queens in here because I think that my opponent, because of my loose image, may be looking to stack off with me here with something like jacks. If it weren't for my looser image, I think at any 2-5 table, even against a decent opponent, I wouldn't be shoving a 5-bet after a 4-bet with queens. I just don't think you're going to get called by worse often enough to include that. I would just strictly keep it to aces, kings, and ace king and call it a day. But again, I think I could get called by worse, but just because of my image. So I wouldn't include that normally in your premium 4-betting range. So where I would put that instead is our answer to number 3 in a more normal scenario. Let me load up that range here. Okay, so this is those items that is our lighter 3-betting range here. Again, this is not light in terms of these are bluffs by any means, because if you look at them here, they're perfectly good playable hands that if our opponent is calling our 3-bets fairly wide when he's in position to watch, which is what we would suspect, then these hands are going to be ahead a very decent amount of the time. So they're not bluffs by any means, but what they are is these are the hands that if our opponent 4-bets us, these are the ones that we're going to not defend with. Okay. So that is, again, that is 68 combos. You'll see right here. Okay, for question number 4, this is kind of an introduction to something that we've touched on before, but a couple of the questions in this homework are really going to focus on that, and that is the concept of minimum defense frequency. So I give you a hypothetical to kind of give you a primer on how to do this. So let's say you 3-bet to 100 and the villain 4-bets to 250. So when he did so, when he put in his bet of 250, the existing pot after our 3-bet was 135. Okay, so to figure out what his required equity, i.e. how much he needs us to fold here, for that move, it is, as the math says there, we take his bet, and then it's always risk over risk plus reward. So his risk is 250, and his reward is he gets that 250 back if he puts it in and we fold. And he also gets the 135 that's also in the pot. So if you do that math, it turns out to be about 65%. So what we do then is we take the inverse of that, and that is, just 100% minus that 65, and that turns out to be 35%. So that's how much of our range we need to call here to meet minimum defense frequency. Now, if you studied some of this before, you might be saying, is that exactly right? No, it's kind of an approximation because both sides have equity actually, like, as the hand runs out. So, like, his required equity is enhanced a little bit by actually, like, what his actual holding is. But this is but we have that also. So this is a fairly decent approximation. And all we're doing is we're running just kind of a basic computation here to see whether or not our ranges that we're using here can properly stand up to pressure approximately. If we're way off, then we need to make some adjustments. If we're in the ballpark, then we're doing fine. Okay, so let's see how mine hold up here. So what I then do is 35. The top 35% of your range means that you should be defending that many combos of our overall range. So what we have here so far are our answer to number 2 plus our answer to number 3. These two combined are our total 3-betting range. Okay. Out of that, what percent is this range? Is our answer to number 2, our premium element, the ones that we are going to defend to a 4-bet. And it comes out, well, so at 35%, that means you want the ratio to be about 2-to-1, and mine turned out to be exactly that. I promise I didn't plan that. It just so did happen when I selected my ranges here. They were spot on. 68 combos to 34 is exactly 2-to-1. So that is what you are looking for given that math. Okay, so that means that our opponent, if we're defending like this, can't just put out a 4-bet with any old combo and exploit us because we're not defending enough. And that is what we're looking for. Okay, so question and answer number 5 is, what would your flatting range be, if any, and the number of combos in it? So now we've got our linear 3-bet range. So we start from the top, work our way down. This is, I'll show you here, this is the combined range between the two of them. And this is hypothetically where you could stop. you could elect, if you wanted to not have any flatting range below this range whatsoever, and just 3-bet or fold here from the small blind. And you might have read some material that suggests doing just that. That's a perfectly fine strategy if you want to adopt it. I would recommend for low stakes play, though, that is a little overreactionary and unnecessary, and you're going to wind up not playing some otherwise very playable hands that you can just go ahead and flat with. The reason that the material out there that suggests that does so is because it's writing to an audience that's either, one, playing higher stakes, or two, is playing online, or perhaps, both, like nosebleed online stakes, right? And why it's saying to do that is because if you are playing against very sophisticated opposition and you flat from the small blind when they've seen you 3-bet a lot from the small blind before, they're immediately going to know that you have a weaker hand that's below your linear 3-bet range. And what are they going to do? They're going to pretty much robotically and automatically throw out a squeezing 3-bet from the big blind. So that's the question, is what's the guy in the big blind like? So I guess the only time where you'd really want to adopt a 3-bet or fold only strategy from the small blind, like those books are suggesting, is when you do somehow have like Mr. I play 1025 sometimes sitting on your direct left in a 2-5 game. Now, may I humbly suggest that if you find yourself in that situation, please don't stay there for long and seat change or table change or whatever it takes to not have the best dude in the room who's randomly playing 2-5 on your left. You shouldn't find yourself in that spot. But if you do, you can 3-bet or fold only. But if not, if you're in the realm of regular mere mortals who play 2-5, then here's what you could do. You could instead flat with a range like this. And if you look at, again, our range from answer 3 and then our answer to number 4, which is our flatting range here, you'll see it's just a very small range, very, very small, of combos that are right below that. Okay, so pocket 9s, 8s, and then this band of suited hands up here, and then down here, some suited connectors, and then some stronger suited value hands up here, and then ace 10 offsuit and king jack offsuit, which are just right below our less premium, lighter range of 3-bets. And I can guarantee you, these are perfectly fine hands to play here, even out of position. The suited hands and offsuited hands in this band right here could very well be miles ahead of your opponent's opening range from the button here. And also you have these very strong, versatile suited connectors here, which might just win from high card value. I mean, your opponent could very well be opening like a bunch of low ball banana suited connectors, like 5-4 suited and stuff from the button, and these hands are just like miles ahead of those. So the only danger, again, in flatting things like this is if you're afraid of getting squeezed. That's it. So if you're not, you can flat with these. And will your opponent know you're a little worse off than if you 3-bet? Yeah, obviously. But are you still going to be ahead enough of the time to do so? Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, enough on that topic. All right, so that is the flatting range that you can potentially use in the answer to number 5. All right, for number 6, again, we've gone over a little bit of this, but we are keeping our 3-bet range here tight because our opponent is pretty tight pre-flop. We've noticed that. But we know he's not a nit, so we've included a healthy number of light 3-bet combos, again, about 2-1 versus our premium 3-bet combos. We also have the band of flats because we don't think that this guy is super amazing, and we don't have somebody who's super amazing in the big blind either, so we can go ahead and include those flats. And again, we went over why we kept pocket queens in our shoving range, because we figure villain might freak out and 4-bet with 10s or jacks. Okay. And again, he's a tournament player, so that kind of factors into whether or not he's going to just give it a shove with pocket pairs like jacks and 10s either. I mean, if you've played often enough at a cash game with tournament players, they tend to do that. They're just wired to, if they have a fabulous pocket pair or what they think is, they just shove it in, and they're kind of just wired to do that. Okay. On to part 2 of the pre-flop action. So for this hand, we're going to conduct the rest of the hand as though we had 3-bet. So we carry forward our range from A2 and A3, which is, again, this. Okay. On the flop, with 2-10 in the pot, the flop is, let me put it in here, the ace of spades, the 6 of clubs, and the 3 of clubs. Hey, by the way, I registered Flopzilla before doing this month's homework problems here, so it's not going to yell at me and not let me put in the turn in the river. So, all right, way to go. Technology is improving here. All right, so question and answer number 7 is, who has the range advantage on this flop? And if you're unfamiliar with this question, just very brief overview. This is just generally range versus range here. My 3-betting range versus his defending range to a 3-bet. Overall, a 3-betting range is obviously going to be much stronger. If he had a super strong range himself, he would have 4-bet me, right? So my range is just naturally stronger. But when the flop comes down, there are going to be some flops which favor the defender. And those are going to be ones that are very, very middle card heavy. Things like 7, 8, 9 or 8, 9, 10. Things like that. Those are cards that, I mean, look at my range. I don't have those cards in my range, right? Okay. I don't have any of those cards I just mentioned. They're down here, we're up here. All right, so particularly when our opponent is going to suspect that we have this more linear range, boards like that are going to be serious trouble. Okay, that is not this board. This board is wonderful because of one factor: it has an ace in it. And if you look at our range, we're just absolutely drowning in aces. So great for us. Who has the range advantage on this board? We do, because we have way more aces than our opponent does. Now, I mean, he has hands that have an ace in it, but we are so hyper condensed to have so many aces per square mile, if you will, that we're just drowning in them. Now, what's the problem with that, though? The problem with that is our range is actually too strong. If you look at the board of ace-6-3 with a suit on it, we have such a overwhelming range advantage here that we're really going to struggle to find enough bluffs. Like, what do we bluff with on this board? Really, we only have our suited combos that don't have an ace in it, right? We don't want to start using ace 10 of spades, right, as like, and call that a bluff, because that we don't want to select bluffs that have showdown value, particularly not top pair showdown value, right? So we only have a few of these suited combos right here, the king queen, the king jack, that are pure bluffs on this board, and we have absolutely zippity doodah here, which interacts with this board as a straight in any fashion, not even gut shots. Okay, so our range is actually too strong to split up into our normal components, which we would say if this were just a regular old single raise pre-flop pot. We would have all kinds of suited combos, which we could go ahead and bluff with here. We might have things like, that might have some interaction with the 6 and the 3. But with this extremely strong range, we just don't. Okay, so what do we want to do here as a result of that? If you find, this is particularly true in 3-bet pots like this, that your range advantage is so absolutely crushing that you really can't find enough bluffs as you look at your overall range, then there's really only one thing to do, and that is to not split your range up at all. And that means making what's called a range bet. And if you like some more material on this, I actually just wrote and sent in today a Poker News article, which will be up in a couple days. It's October 16th, 2018 right now. So the article that comes out just a couple days after this also includes a little bit of a discussion on range betting also. And the gist here is, again, that we are going to bet with absolutely everything. So every single stinking combo that you see up here, we are going to bet. Now, when we do something with more combos and with a strong range, we, as a rule, want to, in terms of optimal balance play, we want to bet a lot less. Whenever we do something with more combos, we bet less. All right, so how much are we going to bet here? All right, and this is the answer to number 8. Since we're taking the single action with our entire range, we want to size smaller, and that goes on to flop action part 2 into the pot of 210. I'm recommending a bet of around $90. So with every single combo up here, we would bet $90. And of course, since our homework problem is going to carry on, the villain goes ahead and calls. So that takes us to the turn with $390 in the pot. And the turn is the 7 of hearts. And there's our turn board right here. And the action is on us. So now something has happened in the range versus range dynamic between us and the villain here based on what occurred on the flop. So we bet with our entire range. So the normal filtering process that occurs from street to street to street as you go on, both players' ranges in a normal kind of world, both of them get stronger, right? It's kind of, one book I read compares it to like a pyramid, and by the river you kind of get up to the peak, but down here in the earlier streets you're still narrowing both of your ranges. Well, only one player's range got narrowed when we use that smaller sizing on the flop, and that's our opponent's. So his range got stronger, whereas ours stayed exactly the same as it was. And his probably increased dramatically because he might know that also. Okay. He knows that he needs a decent hand to get to the turn here that's going to hold up against our range as a whole. So he's probably thought and considered that before he made the call. So that means, and this is normally how this goes if you do make a range bet on the flop. Now, on the turn, we are going to go ahead and split our range into different components here and do different things with it. Here's the problem, though, is that we still have a just absolutely crushing range advantage on this board because the 7 on the turn really changes absolutely nothing. If we still just have the same amount of aces, which is a ton, that we did previously. So our range here is now really, really super strong. So there is an argument to be made that if we wanted to, we could just range bet again. However, I think we should probably drift away from doing that, because we might find ourselves, if we do that, smack up against our opponent's range that's just become a little bit too strong as that gets filtered and ours doesn't whatsoever over the course of 2 streets. Okay. So what do we want to bet with here for value? This is kind of the easy answer, and that's our answer to number 10, which is we're going to bet here with 15 combos of our sets, which is the set of aces, and then ace king suited and offsuited for top pair, top kicker. That is 15 combos. Pretty straightforward. I think everybody would agree that is what they would go ahead and bet with there. Now, What we don't want to do is start betting. Let's look at our overall range that we bring here with. If we start betting all of our aces for value here, our range is going to be so incredibly strong as to throw us into the realm of imbalance just immediately. So we really only want to be betting with these premium combos here, our sets and our ace king only. Also, as we went over in last month's homework, it's very important that we have some kind of strength in our check calling range here. We don't want to let our opponent know that if we bet all of our aces, then everything else is just going to be a give up. And so our opponent is really going to know right away, super easy. He bets he has an ace, he checks he doesn't. We don't want to make it that easy on our opponent. We want to include a nice, healthy dose of our aces in our checking range here so that we have something that we can defend with even against two streets of betting. Okay. So these are the only 15 combos I decided to use here for value bets. Now comes the very interesting part. All right. For answer 11, this is, so then what are your bluffs? And when you did this homework, I'm sure you really, like I did, immediately struggled with what the heck are my bluffs here. You only have, not many, you only have really one flush draw here whatsoever. And so you have flush draws that have showdown value because you have ones that have aces in them, but we don't want to use those as bluffs. What we want to use those here is we want to use those for check calls that when our opponent bets and we call here and a club rolls off on the river, we want to have some combos that have the nut flush in them so that our opponent just can't barrel us into oblivion when the flush draw completes, knowing that we bet all of our flush draws, even the ones that had aces in them. So we only want to use our non-showdown value flush draws. Okay, so let's take a look at, this is my answer to number 11. So I said I would bet with all of my king-queen, both suited and offsuit. And again, the king-queen here also, king-queen suited doesn't, of course, include king-queen of clubs. So that's the one flush draw combo in addition to the king-jack. One combo that I said I would include also for a total of 17. Now, in answer number 12, I said originally when I did the answers to this problem, I just put king-queen of clubs and king-jack of clubs when I first did this. And then I was like, holy crap, I have a ratio of 15-2 for my value to bluffs. And if you run the numbers on that, that means, well, your range is obviously just way too strong. It's hideously imbalanced. If you wanted to put out a sizing to keep that ratio balanced, you'd have to bet something really ridiculously stupidly low here, like betting something like $70 into a pot of 390. It's just absurdly low, and everybody would call it 100% of the time. So we need to find a way to include more bluffs here than just 2 combos versus 15 in order to keep it balanced. So where do we go for that? Well, we go for other blockers. Here, we consider the blocker effect of our combos and what we want our opponent to not have that would call us here. So for that, what is that? That is king-queen, because this blocks pocket kings, pocket queens. Not saying he wouldn't have 4-bet us with it, but there's a chance he might have just flatted. Some people get tricky sometimes, so it does block those. But more importantly, it blocks ace-king and ace-queen. And those are combos that certainly a lot of players would just go ahead and flat with to a 3-bet. pre-flop. And those are the primary thing we're going to get called by here. So blocking those combos that have aces in them, by virtue of using our king queen here, which take out some of those combos of ace king, ace queen. That's why we want to use those as our bluffs, just purely for their blocker effect. Now, is that easy to figure out in game? No, but that's why we're doing this homework problem. Because that, I think, is lesson number one that you want to take away from this homework here, is that if that didn't occur to you right away, that's perfectly fine, because it didn't occur to me right away either. But in future, you might be thinking, okay, let me think about my overall range here. Let me think about what bluffs do I have. Ooh, I don't really have that many on this board whatsoever. I need to reach down. You could be sitting there with something like king queen offsuit in a spot here and think, ooh, I kind of want to bluff at this because I have no showdown value, but am I bluffing too much here? If I bluff with king queen, that seems like a stretch. It has what drawing equity does it have? Probably not much, unless your opponent is calling with pocket jacks or pocket tens here, something like that. Am I really betting this here as a bluff to try and hit a draw? Maybe, sort of, kind of, but not really. More, you're doing it here to maintain balance and for that blocker effect. So that's a little bit counterintuitive from, I think, the way most people normally select their bluffs. But if you want to dip into this realm of becoming more balanced in your play, then you have to start to, in situations like this where you don't have natural bluffs, as they're usually called, we have to look a little bit further afield for stuff that's unconventional, like including king queen offsuit here. All right. So we've gone through answers to 11 and 12 again. Now, including these, I have a ratio of value to bluff of 15 to 17, which is perfectly fine. It's around 1-to-1, which is what we're usually looking for on the turn. And because of that now, because my sizing is balanced, I don't have to go super small like I would if I was making either a range bet or some bet with a hugely value heavy range, like back when my range was 15-2 in terms of ratio. I can now get more creative with my sizing, and I can do something like betting around 300 into the pot of 390. Okay, let's see what is next. So for 13, we will check the remainder of our combos. Do we feel that we included enough combos in our checking range to keep it strong? We sort of went over this before. Yes, we have combos like ace-queen. You can certainly check call with that for 2 streets. We're out of position here on the turn, so we have to think about that our opponent may bet both turn and river when we go. He might go check, bet, and we call, and check, bet, and we call again on a blank river. We can do that certainly with ace-queen. No questions asked there. And we also have flush draw combos like ace of clubs, 10 of clubs that can hit the nuts if the flush draw completes. So our opponent just can't barrel us off any club river, which is important. All right, so to check those ranges, the rest of the homework here is a couple of scenarios that are based on what happens when we do something on the turn with different ranges, and then what happens when the river runs out with a certain card. These are kind of hypothetical line checks to see how our ranges fare. So number 1 is the pot is 390 on the turn. We bet 300 with our range from A10 and A11. Again, that's these with our value component here, and then our bluffing component, our 17 to 15 combos of bluffs to value. Villain calls, and that leaves 5-10 in his stack. Now, one of the reasons you wanted to use that $300 sizing on the turn is particularly for this reason, is you always want to be thinking about what is my bet size going to do in terms of what my opponent's river stack is going to be. to set up a shove, whether or not it's a shove for value or it's a shove as a bluff. We want to see what is our opponent going to have left to operate with here on the river and massage our turn sizing to get the result that we want to. So here we set up around a little over half pot size shove on the river. That looks good. And the river pot is 990, 510 left in his stack. There we go. We'll say for scenario number 1, the river is the 9 of diamonds, which for all intents and purposes is a complete and utter banana. And would you shove your entire range here of A10 and A11? If not, what would you leave out? So our entire value range, which was aces and ace-king. Again, I think this is perfectly fine to go ahead and shove with for half pot. I think we'll get called off by worse aces easily, the amount that we need to. And that's why we wanted to select such a just top-heavy, solely 15 combos of value here and not start drifting down into things like ace-queen, ace-jack, where those things we use to strengthen our checking range, yes, but the second consideration is also they're just hands that we don't want to be barreling a 3-bet pot for 3 streets with for value. Our opponent knows our range is super strong too. Is he going to call off with ace-10 to a 3-bet and then 3 streets at a shove on the river? Maybe not. Okay, so do we want to be using ace-jack as a 3-street value bet here for that reason? No. If we were against a completely unsophisticated player who just says, I have ace-deuce suited, let's rip it in here on the river. I have an ace, I have to call all the way down. Okay, different story, but like we went over at the beginning, that's not this villain. We have to be more cautious here. So that's why we're just using only our ace-king for 3 streets of value. All right, so what would we shove with for bluffs? Well, I say we would... Here's the complete range, and we are just going to use, for bluffs, any combo which has a club, we're going to take it out. Why? Because we want to... Oh, I forgot to put in the river card here. Let me do that. We said it was a 9 of diamonds. 1 second. Okay, so that, again, there's our final board. And if we look at our final board here, what are we looking to bluff off a lot of? And that is missed club draws. So if we have a club, that blocks our opponent having a club draw. Now, our bluffs are king-queen, so, are we absolutely, are we worried that much about blocking these particular clubs? Maybe not, but we do have to draw the line somewhere, and so I think that's we don't want to bluff with our entire set of king queens here, because then we're just absolutely bluffing too much. So we need to remove some of them. We need to, again, filter our range down a little bit from street to street with what we're betting here. So that just is a kind of natural way to drop out some of those bluffs to make sure that we're not over bluffing here. Okay, so that gives us it says 24 combos here. And if I'm recalling correctly, our value is 15. So that means that our bluffs are 9, and that is a perfectly good ratio right there for our river sizing. 15 to 9 is a general rule. That sounds great for value to bluffs on a river. Okay, so that is how I would split those up and answer 14. All right, so that's our scenario for if we bet the turn and then we get a blank river, which is going to happen quite a bit. Scenario 2 is what happens if we check and then the villain checks behind. Okay, this is a kind of more interesting scenario here. And this is going to test our strength of our checking range. So this leaves the river pot the same 390 that was on the turn, and we're going to say the river is the same 9 of diamonds. So same complete banana blank. All right, so on to question number 15. What value combos would you bet with here? And let me load up. This is my range that I said. This is 24 combos that we checked on the turn, and now we should feel comfortable after our opponent checks back on the turn going ahead and value betting with here. We would highly suspect that if our opponent had a better ace than any of these, he would have betted on the turn. If he has ace king, he's just betting on the turn. That's just like 100% certainty. So our ace queens and ace jacks, we can go ahead and fire. Because he was probably also firing with ace queen or ace jack also. Any of the strong aces he's firing on the turn, these are perfectly, fine. And they could get called off by worse aces, like ace 10. He might have gone ahead and checked that back on the turn, just thinking to himself, he's not getting 2 streets of value if he bets that both turn and river if we're checking the turn. And so he might elect to take kind of a pot controlling line on the turn. Perfectly standard issue, especially from a tournament player, may I say. And then he will go ahead, but he's obviously going to commit to call that off when we bet on a blank river like this. That was his game plan all along if he checked back some of his weaker aces. So those are certainly value combos that we can use. And again, I'm hesitant to use ace-10 suited for the reasons that we just said, is now we're getting down into the territory where, did he check back ace-jack on the turn? Maybe he did. Because if he's a pretty conservative tournament player, he may be used to taking that kind of pot-controlling line. Very common in tournaments. You don't want to lose your entire stack on one top pair versus top pair, better kicker kind of hand, and so you take those pot controlling lines. Now we're drifting down to the realm where he might have checked back something like ace-jack. I don't think we want to screw around with starting to value bet with ace-10 here. All right, so that means this is a very strong, solid range here. There's no reason why we can't just put out a large bet here. Villain is going to have in mind hands that he decided when he checked back the turn what he was going to call a blank river with, and so we can go ahead and a little bit exploitatively, I feel, just test that range and make our bet here large and say, now, if you had something you intended to call off with, all right, here you go, buddy. Here's a 2/3 pot size bet. Let's see it. Stick it in there. And I think you'll get called way more than you need to, particularly at 2-5. All right, so what are our bluffs then? All right, so this is now for answer 16. We're going to use our king-queen, again, for some of the blocker effects that we discussed previously. All right. These are the things that we're going to use for their blocker effect. The king-queen, again, offsuit, and the king-queen and king-jack suited that are not the clubs for the same reasons of not wanting to block the club draw that he could have checked back with on the turn. Maybe he just has a club draw he decides to take his equity, and he decides to do that on the turn, and we don't want to have we don't want to have too many bluff combos here, and so we again filter that out by taking out the hands that block that flush draw. And of course, these are all remaining non-showdown value combos, which is how we want to select our bluffs. Okay, question 17 is another minimum defense question here, and this is testing whether or not we are over bluffing or under bluffing. So, again, we use we're going to say that we are going to bet 300 into the pot of 390. And for that sizing, what is, this time we're looking at from our perspective, what is our required equity when we make that bet? And because we're on the river, this is a pure question of how often we have to get our opponent to lay down here. So our required equity is 300 over the calculation that you see there, which comes out to be 30.3%. And then what we do is we take the inverse of that, like we went over earlier, and that becomes villain's defense frequency. And that comes, and what we do then is we establish the little algebra problem that we have there and say, so 69.7% is the inverse of 30.3, and that comes out to be, we put that against our total number of value combos, which again was from A15, 24. All right, and then we figure out what is X in that equation there, and it turns out to be 34 combos. So that, what that gives us is the total amount of combos, both bluff and value. We already know we have 24. So 34 is, for that sizing, the total number of combos that would be in our range for this to be a balanced sizing at that point. So we take that 34 minus the 24 combos that we already had here for our value range, and that turns out to be 10 bluffs. If you didn't follow that completely in my explanation here, just go over the answer to number 17 again. It's written out there, kind of a lot clearer in visual format than I can probably explain it here in audio fashion, but you will see it there. So anyway, what it turns out to be is that we should have only 10 bluffs here for our sizing of 300 and villain's subsequent call. And so question number 18, did you find that you were over bluffing or under bluffing here? Again, I said I was going to use this range, which is on screen here, which is 18 combos. That is too many. I'm over bluffing in this scenario. So even after filtering this down a little bit by taking out the club combos from the suited hands, that leaves me with too many at 18. So what we should do instead is this, is we should take out instead the king-queen offsuits that have a club. So further filtering down by that club blocker, and that takes out an additional 6 combos there, leaving us with 12. That's still too many, but I really don't see how to, unless our brain is a computer, differentiate anymore, because there's just no more club-possessing combos to take out of what otherwise we're going to be bluffing with. So unless you can mentally flip a coin somehow and decide what you're going to take out, that's where we're going to have to leave it, is we're going to have to leave it at 12. But that's perfectly fine for, for normal, live, my head is not a computer type of play. So what did we learn from this exercise? Well, I'll tell you, that is one thing I learned right there, is that I would be over bluffing in this situation. Is that I included a few too many bluffing combos here on the river in that second scenario. The other thing that I learned also, again, was back from the turn, is that I needed to put in more bluffing combos, and I learned how I needed to select those from some non-traditional hands based on blockers to my opponent's calling combos. So I would use, again, things that had kings, things that had queens in them, because they would block ace king, ace queen, etc. That's the other thing that I learned, and hopefully you learned a little bit about how to do a couple of different minimum defense calculations here also. While I was speaking, I just want to real quick go over something from answer number 17 again. I kind of misstated this, and I'm sorry. One of these days I will get video editing software for this so I can go back when I screw something up like this and fix it. But for right now, we're doing this all in one take, so bear with me. So for 17, I incorrectly said we were looking at this from our perspective. What the math there is for 17 is we're figuring out what his required equity to call us. So that's why it's 300. That's his call versus 300 plus 300 plus 390 is 390 is what's in the pot. He gets his 300 back, and the other 300 is what we, as the hero here, have already bet into him. So that right there is the 30.3 is what his total equity, how often he needs to be right, essentially. So if he needs to be right 30.3% of the time, that gives you the rest of the math that's there for how often we have to be bluffing to make him, for that sizing, indifferent to calling, i.e. getting as close as possible as we can based on how much we're bluffing versus how much we're value betting. Our goal there is we want to have the answer come out to be that it's as close to 30.3% of the time that he's right as possible. One of the ways I like to think about this is, let's just say we put all the possibilities of whether he's right or whether he's wrong into like a bunch of little tokens that say right and a bunch of little tokens that say wrong, and dump them all into a grab bag, right? And then shake it up. I have some like board games that are like this. Shake it up, and then reach in and pick out a random token, right? We want it to say you're right to call here as close to 30.3% of the time as possible. So our goal is to fashion our ratio of bluffs to value here such that it gets as close to that as possible. And that means he can't make a decision, a correct decision based upon solely our bet sizing or the way we construct our range there. We've truly made it so that he can't make a right answer there. No matter what he does, it's going to be zero expected value for him. That's what we're doing with that math there. And that is one of the main reasons why we work on this type of GTO-based analysis in these homework problems, is getting a feel for what do I need to include in my bluffing and value combos here in order to kind of approach that standard. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Are you going to get to the point where you can do that at the table right away? No, I haven't yet either. But what you can do is learn things like, oh, well, on the turn, if I'm only betting my two combos as bluffs that are flush draws, then wowee, am I grossly under bluffing there, and my opponent can just crazy exploitatively overfold. That's what he should do on the turn. If you bet at 15 combos of value to 2 combos of bluffs there on that turn, he should just be folding. Particularly when you use, let's say, you put out $300 for a bet on that turn with those 15 value combos to 2 bluff combos, you should just be folding there almost all the time. And you probably have seen people and spots like this where if they barrel the turn here, you just absolutely know they have an ace 100% of the time. So the goal for what we discussed primarily today is don't be that guy. Be somebody who actually does have a proper amount of bluffs, neither over bluffing nor under bluffing on both turns and river like this in 3-bet pots, which takes practice, which takes homework like this to do. You should be doing this on these problems, and you should be doing this with your own play. Get a equity calculator. Which way am I pointing? That way. There we go. Like Flopzilla, that's up here. I'll circle it a couple times. Get something like this. Now you know how to do things like this from your hands that you get from your own play. Write them down like Tracy and I do. Go through this and say, was I hideously imbalanced or not? Okay, well, that's it for this month's homework. I think we went a little bit longer than last time, but I hope you all don't mind getting your dollar value worth here out of learning experience, and that's what we're trying to bring to you. Thank you, as always, to all of you, our premium poker friends, your continued support through Patreon and your monthly subscriptions. Really, really appreciate it. It lets us continue to do stuff like this. There's a message up on Patreon today that I fixed the Discord that I didn't know was broken. So thank you to our one listener who clued me into that after he subscribed. It is fixed now. So follow the directions that are in that Patreon post that I just put up today to fix your Discord if it was broken to begin with. You should have the roles then that you need to go ahead and ask questions in there. You can make comments about these homework problems. You can bring things to my attention about them, and you can chip in and say, could you give a word or two or 20,000 like I often do about this particular topic when you do the webinar for next month. Love to hear that feedback. Love to hear what you thought about these so far, what you learned, what you'd like to continue to learn, maybe what we can focus on in months to come. So with that, signing off here. Thank you very much as always. Good variance to you, and we will see you on the podcast next and for next month's homework webinar, which will hopefully be up a little bit sooner than this one was. Have a wonderful week, everybody.